Well, when I was 18, I graduated from high school, just like a lot of our teens are going to do in just a few months. And when I graduated from high school, I enrolled in Bible college. That's where I was going to go after high school. And I enrolled in this Bible college, which, honestly, it was a little conservative. By that, I mean it had a lot of rules. And as an 18-year-old kid, when I enrolled in this school, they sent me this lifestyle covenant, a bunch of rules basically that we had to sign on the dotted line that said, this is what we are going to follow when we live on campus. And as an 18-year-old kid, I was so excited about going to college that I got this lifestyle covenant and all these rules. I really didn't read it. I signed on the bottom line because I just wanted to go to college. But here's the problem. I was rules averse. I've never met a rule I didn't want to break. And this college, at 18 years of age, had a lot of rules. They had rules about curfew, when you had to come and get into the dorm and be in the dorm. And, every teenager knows that the fun doesn't begin until the curfew starts, right? And so I broke that rule. They had rules about dress code. They had rules about what you could and couldn't wear to class. And even if you weren't in class, if you were in the academic building, you had to wear a certain dress code. They even had a dress code about what you had to wear on Sunday. I never knew how much I wanted to wear jeans on Sunday until I was told I couldn't. And honestly, I'm probably still rebelling today. They had rules about movies, what movies you could and you couldn't go see. And we were only supposed to see G-rated movies, but everybody knows that G means good, but PG means pretty great, right? And R, well, that means radical. And so I broke that rule. I was rules averse. I went to this school, I signed this thing, but I did not want to follow any rules. Are you rules averse? Are you like me at 18 years of age when I said, I am rules averse. I do not want to follow any rules. Or are you like some of the classmates that I had that were rule junkies, right? They loved the rules. I had a roommate who loved the rules. Every time I broke the rule, he made sure he told me what the rule was that I was breaking. It was very helpful, so I knew exactly what to break. But some of us are rules averse, and some of us are rules junkies. We love rules. We even make up rules upon rules so that we can have more rules that we can follow, right? We are rule junkies. Which are you? Are you rules averse or are you a rule junkie? I want you to turn to your neighbor right now and I want you to confess. I want you to confess whether you're rules averse or rules junkie. Some of you guys are having a lot of fun with this. Are there a lot of rule breakers? Because I got to tell you, there's a police officer at the back right now. And some of you rule people are wondering, oh yeah, I bet that police officer is here for Kirk right now. Actually, no. Well, he's here for Jesus is why he's actually here. This is Officer Brad Young as part of our church. So when he comes through the door like he did today, please don't freak out like some of you did today. I know some of you are rules averse. He's not here for you. He's here for Jesus. Some of us are rules averse and some of us are rules junkies. Some of us love rules and some of us really despise rules. We've never met a rule we didn't want to break. Some of us have rules upon rules that we just love more rules. Please give me more rules. And some of you right now are thinking, that doesn't describe me in either way. Think with me about this. Really what it is when it comes to rules, when we are averse to rules and whether we are junkies of rules, is really, it all comes down to authority. All comes down to authority. See, the people who are rules averse are casting off the rules because they want to be in authority. But here's the thing. The person who likes rules, they also want authority. And they have rules in order to establish themselves as the authority. And some of you thinking that still doesn't describe me, but let me just put it this way. Think with me about this, okay? I want you to think back to the last time you were at a sporting event, okay? Do you have that in your mind? Maybe it was a Rider game last fall. Maybe it was a Pats game recently. Maybe it was your son or your daughter or your grandchild or your nieces or nephews' sporting event. Do you have that in your mind? I want you to think about it. And here's one thing I know all of us did, a thought that crossed our mind, or maybe words that came out of our mouth. It was this: at some point during that game, there was the thought or the words that were spoken that went, "What was that? Come on, ref!" Some of you didn't speak it, but some of you thought it, right? All of us have been to a sporting event and we've had that moment. If you know all about the rules of the game, what you're saying in that moment is that I know more than the ref does, that I have a better way of seeing things than the ref does, and you're grasping for authority. But even if you don't know the rules, I'm willing to bet that at some point during the game, as your grandchild tried to make that goal as they kicked the ball and the ref didn't call that foul that was made on them, that at some point during the game, that you said, "Come on, ref, what are you doing?" And even though you don't know all the rules, you still grasped for authority. And you thought you know more than the ref does. You see, all of us are wrestling for authority. We are grasping for it. We are clinging to it. All of us want authority in one way or another. We don't want to be told what to do. We want to tell others what to do. We all wrestle with authority. Here's the problem with this. The problem is that when we wrestle or cling or grasp for authority, we break connection with the people around us. We break connection with God. You see, connection in relationship always comes through submission. And as long as we wrestle with authority, as long as we want to be in charge, as long as we want to hold all the truth, we are breaking connection with God and with each other, because the path to connection leads through submission. Let me show you why I say this. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Mark. We've been looking at Mark since Christmas, looking at what Jesus has to say and the marks of the Messiah. And today we're looking at Mark chapter 11, verses 27 to 33. And as we catch up with Jesus at this point, he's in Jerusalem, and it's Passover week. Passover is a celebration of what God has done in the past in Exodus, actually, with Moses and the Israelites. And Jesus is in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, and this is just a few days before the cross, before Jesus will be arrested. He will be tried and unjustly accused and then executed on a cross. But he won't stay dead. He'll be resurrected. And in a few weeks, we'll celebrate that on Resurrection Sunday, on Easter. And it says this in verse 27, they arrived again in Jerusalem. And while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders, these are powerful people. Okay, these are the power brokers in Jerusalem. They're responsible for all of Judaism. They are the people that you want to be on the good side of. These leaders have all the power. And it says this, they came to Jesus. And they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked. "And who gave you authority to do this?" Basically, what they're saying to Jesus is, who said you could say that? Who said you could do that? It kind of seems like it comes out of the blue, doesn't it? It seems like this is just a surprise question, a surprise attack. But if we look into the context of what's going on here, what we discover is that these leaders have come to Jesus in response to what he has just done. You see, a day or two before, Jesus was in Jerusalem again. And the city was full of people. It's kind of like what happens when we host Grey Cup, right? You know what happens when we host Grey Cup? All the hotels are full, all the restaurants are full, right? All of these long-lost friends that you haven't seen since high school all of a sudden remember that you exist and live in Regina, and they call up and they say, "Hey, do you have a spare room?" Anybody else have that happen? Right? You never hear from them except when we host Grey Cup. And that's what happens at Passover. What happens at Passover is that Jews from far and wide, they come to Jerusalem, and the population grows exponentially. It's crowded. It is a major, mega city, and for this 1 week, as all the Jews, all the men for sure, some brought their families, come to Jerusalem, but by law, they were all required, the men, to go to Passover. And it exponentially grows. And Jesus is in Jerusalem a few days before this encounter with the leaders. And what happens is he walks into the temple to worship God. And he sees all of these people selling doves and exchanging money. Now, these are necessary businesses, okay? You see, all of these people who flock to Jerusalem, they come to offer sacrifices. And they aren't going to bring all these sacrifices with them because it's just going to slow them down. And so they're selling doves for sacrifices. Now, they're selling them at exorbitant rates, right? Because we always have to gouge the tourists. Isn't that the way that it works, right? I traveled this week. I was down in Chicago, and in Pearson International Airport on a layover, and I had to get some yogurt because I hadn't had breakfast, and they charged me $7. for a thing of yogurt that I could have bought at Superstore for like $1. That's what we do, right? We gouge the tourists. That's what's going on there. That's not a good thing, but it's something that's going on. And they're exchanging money, and if you've ever tried to exchange money at an airport, you know how much they gouge you there as well, right? And that's what's going on, but that's not what Jesus is upset about. That's not what Jesus sees that causes him to react. Actually, what happens is he sees that the people who have a necessary business, that they have overtaken one of the courtyards. They've overtaken a courtyard that was specific for the Gentiles. It was the court of the Gentiles is what it was called. And this was a place where all of the Gentiles, that's you and me, people who aren't Jewish, would come and they would worship God together because they were not allowed into other parts of the temple. And during Passover week, all of these salespeople and money lenders and exchangers have come in and they've set up shop, so much so that the Gentiles cannot come and worship God. And Jesus loses it. He gets upset. He quotes from the prophet Isaiah who says, "My house will be called a house of prayer." And we usually stop there, but what he fully says is, "My house will be called a house of prayer for the nations." And this is how we know that it wasn't about the money lending or selling of doves. That was a necessary business. It was about the fact that this system of structures that was set up at that time by the leaders was actually keeping people, the Gentiles, from encountering God. And Jesus reacts. And he starts to overturn tables. He starts to chase people out of there. And he won't let anyone with merchandise back into this courtyard. Why? Because he desperately wants people to encounter God. And these things are keeping them from encountering the living God. And the leaders of the temple, these power brokers, they come to Jesus and they say to him, "What gives you the right to do this? Who said you could do this?" That's a paraphrase, but that's basically what they're saying. By what authority are you doing what you do? Here's the thing. These guys had been around Jesus for some time. Jesus had been around for 3 years. Ministry. He was 33 about this time. So he'd been around for a lot of Passovers, but 3 years specifically ministering around Galilee and in Judea, in Jerusalem. And he'd been there. And every time Jesus is teaching and ministering, he bumps up against people like these power brokers. But these power brokers had kind of left him alone up until this point. You see, what was going on is they were okay with Jesus doing his thing as long as his thing didn't interfere with their thing. But when his thing started to interfere with their thing, this is when they reacted. And Jesus causes this disruption in the temple, and the leaders begin to react. They were fine when Jesus was up in Galilee and he was healing people. That's okay, we can live with that. That can fit within our worldview and our system of religion. They were modestly okay when he was freeing people from impure spirits. Okay, we don't totally understand that, but okay, we'll let it go. They were okay when he was teaching. But when it started to impact them directly, when he came to Jerusalem and started to upset the system and structures of religion that they had placed around themselves, then they reacted. And actually, they go on from here, and this is the catalytic moment where they decide, we need to get rid of this guy. As long as Jesus didn't impact their thing, they were happy to let him be. They had created a worldview and a system of religion that was, supposed to connect them with God. And I think we have to be careful as we look at this group, because we shouldn't paint this whole group as bad guys, okay? These were deeply religious people who desperately wanted to connect with God. Some of them were paid professionals. They were paid to lead the people in worship, and they desperately wanted to worship God. They desperately wanted to be in a relationship with him. The problem was that they had created a worldview. They had created a system and a structure of religion that actually did the opposite of what they were wanting to do. And when Jesus comes along, what they try to do is they say, okay, how can we adapt? How can we tack Jesus onto our worldview, onto our system of religion? But here's the thing, Jesus isn't an add-on. And Jesus disrupts their worldview, disrupts their system of religion, so much so that they come to him and they say, who do you think you are? Who gave you authority to do these things? By what right can you do this? And you know what? We are a lot like these religious leaders at times. You see, we've created a system of living, a worldview. And a lot of times we try to tack Jesus on to our system of living. But Jesus is disruptive. And we have ways of living, we have structures, and we hear something that Jesus said, or we hear someone like me talk about something that Jesus did or something that he said, and it begins to make us squirm, and we don't like that very much. Because Jesus is just an add-on. But see, Jesus didn't come to be an add-on to your already busy and complex lives. He came to disrupt it. Because what we are often doing, like the leaders in Jerusalem, does not connect us with God. And Jesus isn't willing to leave us like that. And he comes not to be added on to your already full and busy and complex lives, but to disrupt your way of living so that you can be in relationship with God. So where is there disruption in your life? You know, Jesus speaks through the absence and presence of peace. When Jesus speaks to us, we know it, and when he is present, we have peace. Even when our world is in chaos, even when our life seems to be falling apart, when someone is walking with Jesus and not trying to add him to his life, when their lives are in chaos, you see a deep and abiding peace in them. Because Jesus speaks through the absence of presence of peace. You can tell if he's present by the peace that we have inside, even when things are in chaos in our life. And so the reverse, when life is in chaos and there is a lack of peace in one area or in all areas of our life, we should be paying attention, because quite possibly there is an area of our life where we are not in sync with Jesus. And he is causing some disruption, or there is disruption taking place in our life because we are not walking with him. And we're like those leaders who say to Jesus, "Why should I listen to you? You don't live in the 21st century. You don't know what it costs to live today. You don't know what it's like to be married to this person. You don't know what it's like to work in my job. You don't know what it's like." And we push back on Jesus' authority. And we break connection with God, because connection with God always comes through submission to Jesus. Well, Jesus responds to these leaders. And he says in verse 29, he says, Jesus replied, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Tell me." And Jesus waits. As we go through the book of Mark, we see again and again that John the Baptist keeps kind of resurfacing throughout the account of Jesus' life. We met John the Baptist back in Mark chapter 1. When Mark comes onto the scene and he begins baptizing people, calling them to repentance as evident by baptism. And in that moment, he makes some statements, some key statements about Jesus that I think Mark, as he's writing the account of Jesus' life, that he wants us to keep coming back to, that he's woven the account of John the Baptist through this so that we keep remembering what he said about Jesus at the beginning. You see, what he said about Jesus, he says, someone's coming after me, whose authority is greater than me, whose sandals I'm unworthy to tie. And what he's saying is that there is someone that is so much greater than me, who has so much more authority than me, that I'm not even worthy to be in their presence to tie their sandals. And then he says this, and this person, he says, I baptize with water. But the one who comes after me, whose sandals I'm not worthy to tie, this person will baptize with the Holy Spirit, with the very presence of God. And from the very beginning in Mark chapter 1, we see where Jesus' authority comes from. That John, who is sent to prepare the way for Jesus, actually declares that Jesus is the Son of God, come to baptize us with the Holy Spirit. And Jesus asks these leaders, he says, whose authority did John operate by? You see, if they were to admit that John operated by God's authority, then they would have to admit that Jesus was operating by God's authority as well. And what we need to realize is that Jesus' authority actually flows from the Father. John received his authority from God the Father. But Jesus also receives his authority from God the Father. In the Gospel of John, in another account of Jesus' life, Jesus says this to his disciples. He says, "The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves." And what Jesus is saying is that all of his authority actually comes from the Father. You see, Jesus, who is fully God, who is God come down in the flesh as a human. He is fully God and fully human, and he dies on the cross for us so that we can be forgiven. This Jesus, that he actually lives in complete submission to God the Father. This is what he's saying here. That everything he says, everything he does is not his own choice, but he actually lives in submission to the Father. And Jesus' authority, God himself, Jesus is God, remember? His own authority flows from the Father. Jesus receives his authority from the Father. And so Jesus invites us into this relationship where we live under authority with him, but he also models what it looks like to live under authority to God the Father. And he doesn't call us to do something that he hasn't done himself. Where is there disruption in your life? But the other question is, where are you denying or arguing with Jesus? Because here's the thing, these leaders, they know where the authority of John comes from. They know quite well. Listen to what it says. They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask them, why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, and then in my Bible it says ... means the conversation went on. And then in parentheses it says, they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet sent by God. See, these leaders, they knew where John's authority came from. They understood it, but they were not willing to admit it. And so they argued back and forth, what should we say to Jesus? Because they knew that if they admitted John's baptism was from God, that would also require that they admit the authority that Jesus has over them. And they are not willing to do that. Because to do that would say that they are offside with God. And they're not going to admit that. And we're a lot like that sometimes. We aren't willing to admit that we're offside with God, and we deny and we argue with Jesus rather than admit that we're actually offside. Jesus tells this parable right after this passage that we're in Mark chapter 12. It's a parable about some sharecropper farmers, some tenant farmers. You see, there was this landowner who created this beautiful vineyard. He put a wall around it to protect it. He built a tower in it. He built a press in it. And then he rented it out to some tenants and said, just pay me part of the crop as rent for the land. And the crop grew, and it came time for harvest, and the owner sent a messenger to collect his share of the rent. And the tenants decided they didn't want to pay. And so the tenants beat up the servant and sent him away with nothing. The owner sent another servant. This one they beat up again. He sent another one. This one they killed. And then he thought, I will send my son, and they will surely pay what they owe. And the son goes, and these tenants see the son coming down the road, and they say, look, he's sending the son. Let us kill the son, and then the land will be ours. And Jesus tells this parable to show the absurdness that there is in denying the authority of God. You see, these tenants, they decide they aren't going to pay the rent. But that doesn't change the fact that the owner still owns the crop and the land. These tenants decide they will beat up the servant. But that doesn't change the fact that the owner still owns the land and the crops. The tenants decide to kill the son, but it doesn't change the fact that the owner still has authority over the tenants. And we live in a world today where we say that everything is relative, that my truth is not the same as your truth, that we can hold diverging opinions, and that there is no absolute truth. But it doesn't change the fact that there is a God who has authority over all things. There's still an owner, and we are the tenants underneath his authority. And it is completely absurd to think that there is no authority, that we can take authority for ourselves, that we can displace the creator of the universe, the one who holds all things together, and become our own authority. That is the essence of sin. And Jesus tells this parable to show the absurdity of the leaders in the way they respond to him and his authority. But there's more to this story. You see, this story also reveals what happens when we rebel in one thing. These tenants decided to rebel in just one thing. We're not going to pay the rent. And that one thing led to beating up multiple servants. That one thing led to killing the son and another servant. That one thing led to them trying to steal the land. Here's the thing. When we are in knowing rebellion to one thing, we are in rebellion to all things. And we need to submit to the authority of the Father, to the authority of Jesus Christ. So where are you arguing or denying Jesus' authority in your life? Let's keep reading. These leaders, they discuss what's going on, and they finally come up with an answer to say to Jesus. They probably thought this was a brilliant answer. We don't know. We don't know. They refuse to admit that Jesus has authority. They're trying to sit on the fence. Jesus says this, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. And I want you to see something unique. Earlier in Mark chapter 8, Jesus asks a similar question of his disciples when he's in Caesarea Philippi. Pastor Eric took us through this passage. He says to his disciples, who do people say that I am? And Peter gives this brilliant confession. He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And not too long later, do you remember what happens in Mark chapter 9? We followed this the week later. Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on the mountain after Peter's brilliant confession, and he reveals all of his glory to Peter. Now juxtapose that with what goes on in this passage. A similar question is asked. Who do you say that I am? They don't word it like that, but it's a similar sort of question, which is really, where does your authority come from? Peter recognized that, and he experiences the presence of Jesus on that mountain. These leaders, they don't recognize the authority of Jesus. And do you know what happens? This is a deeply ironic moment in the book of Mark, because here you have deeply religious people who have been for their whole life trying to connect with God, to live life in his presence. Not only that, but they are responsible for leading people into the presence of God. But they refuse to admit the authority of Jesus in their life. And do you know what happens? They don't experience the presence of God. The very thing they are seeking, they don't experience. And Jesus says, neither will I reveal who I really am to you. You see, confession and submission leads to the revelation of Jesus' presence in our life. Jesus reveals his presence when you submit. You see, the path to connection with God, to the presence of God, leads through submission to Jesus Christ. And these leaders who desperately want to connect with God miss out because they're unwilling to recognize who Jesus is. Jesus ends that parable by quoting a verse from the book of Psalms about a cornerstone. He says, the cornerstone, the stone that the builders rejected, has now become the cornerstone. It is marvelous for us to see the Lord did it. And what he's saying here is he's going back to something that would have been common knowledge for the people that were there. And he's speaking about a stone that was used in the construction of the very temple that he's standing within. You see, the builders of the temple in Solomon's day, they were looking for a cornerstone. And a cornerstone was the first stone that was laid when a building was constructed. And everything, today we would call it, a surveyor would call it like a benchmark, okay? And this stone that is laid, everything else is put into alignment with that stone. And if a stone is out of alignment with the cornerstone, it's discarded. It's either corrected or discarded. That's how important a cornerstone is. And the story goes is that there was a stone that they were looking for. They were looking for the perfect cornerstone to begin the construction of the temple, but they could not find it until they went to the discard pile. And they found the perfect stone that held all the walls together, that everything in the temple was aligned to. And Jesus is saying he's that cornerstone. He is the one who we need to align our lives with if we want to connect with God. We have to come into submission to him. Because without him, the life that we seek, the connection with God that we long for, we will never find. And trying to be our own authority, trying to grasp for authority, trying to do things without being in alignment to Jesus will never satisfy us. We will always strive for more and more and more and more, and we will never find contentment without an alignment with Jesus Christ. And it comes through submission. So where is it that you need to submit this week? Jesus reveals his presence when you submit. Where are you missing his presence? Where are you missing his presence because you refuse to submit? Maybe this week you need to do some self-examination to determine where there's disruption, to determine where you are arguing with or denying the authority of Jesus, and then just come to the place where you submit to Jesus. I want to invite the worship team to come back up at this time. And maybe this week, you need to make a decision to stop resisting Jesus in that one area of your life, or to bring your full life under submission of Jesus. Maybe there's a relationship that you know isn't quite right. What you're doing in that relationship is not what Jesus would want for you. Maybe there's a decision you've made that's out of sync with what Jesus wants for you, and you're knowingly living in rebellion. Well, friend, when you live in rebellion to one thing, you live in rebellion to all things. And the only way back is submission to Jesus. We're going to close in a song here. And during this song, here's what I want you to do. If Jesus has been talking to you today, I invite you just to come. Come out from where you are. We're all going to be standing. You may have to climb over some people or over chairs. I don't know. Just come and bend a knee. And for some of you, I know your knees don't bend very well. Mine don't either. But we still need to bend the knee as an act of submission to Jesus. And if you need help getting back up, we can help you with that. But just come. During the song, bend a knee as an act of submission, saying, you know what, I have been living in one area of my life outside the authority of Jesus. Or I've been living my entire life outside the authority of Jesus, and today I decide that I will bend my knee and live in submission with him because I want to live in his presence. I want to be connected to God, and that flows through the path of submission. And just come, bend a knee, and then go back to your seat. Do you need to submit today? What is Jesus saying to you today? What has he been talking to you about? Are you like Peter, who didn't get it all right but was able to bend a knee? Or are you like the leaders that day who aren't willing to admit who Jesus really is? Let's sing together, and I invite you to come and bend a knee and connect with Jesus today.